Hi guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. So in this video, I thought as we have had the recent release of Creed 3, I thought I would do my own ranking of the Rocky and Creed franchise. So that's the six Rocky movies and the three Creed movies, but I do kind of class them all as one franchise. So yeah, I thought I would just give you a ranking, my personal ranking from worst to best, and give you my reasons why they are ranked this way. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. So just before I start, I just want to say that I don't actually dislike any of the movies in this franchise. I think it's a very consistent franchise, and it was actually kind of hard for me to rank all of the movies in it, but I've given it my best shot anyway. And with that being said, I'm going to go straight to my number 9 pick. So this is my least favourite of the franchise, and I'm going to go with Creed 2. So with Creed 2, we find Adonis Creed has now ascended into the boxing world and he has become world champion. And he finds himself being challenged by this new fighter who is Victor Drago, who is the son of Ivan Drago, who was, of course, the main villain in Rocky 4. And he was also the man responsible for Adonis Creed's father, Apollo Creed. He was responsible for his death. Now, the thing about this movie is they try to add a kind of a personal stake to the story. They try to add a bit of a revenge aspect. They make it more personal because Adonis is fighting the son of the man who killed his father. But the problem I have with this is that Adonis never knew his father. He wasn't even born when Apollo Creed was killed. And also the fact that he's fighting Ivan Drago's son as opposed to Drago himself, it just doesn't really work for me, and it kind of falls flat. I just don't really think that whole personal stake really means a whole lot. I also think this movie kind of squanders the return of Dolph Lundgren as Ivan Drago as well. I remember being really excited when he was announced to be returning, but in the end, I just don't really feel like he's given an awful lot to do in the movie. And yeah, it's quite a shame, to be honest, because I'm a huge fan of Rocky 4, as you will see. I also think the movie is just not very memorable. The story is kind of boring to me. I have a hard time remembering this movie every time I rewatch it. I feel like Sylvester Stallone is kind of underused. I think the Rocky character, his story was kind of over with Rocky Balboa, although he did get a fairly decent story in the first Creed movie, but by this point he's just not needed anymore. So yeah, I still think it's a good movie, but on the whole, it is the one movie from the franchise that just doesn't really have an awful lot to say for me. So for that reason, Creed 2 falls into last place. Right, so into 8th place now, and I'm going to go with the latest movie in the franchise, which is, of course, Creed 3. So in Creed 3, we find Adonis has now been retired for a few years, but he's still active in the boxing world, and he works at this gym where he trains up-and-coming fighters. But at some point in the movie, we get introduced to this character by the name of Dame, who is played by Jonathan Majors, and we find out that him and Adonis have this history together, and Dame wants Adonis to basically help him to become the next world champion, despite the fact that he is probably a bit too old to get started in that. But Adonis feels like he owes him this because of something that happened between them in the past, so he decides to take a chance on him. Now, I do want to give this movie some credit because the direction from Michael B. Jordan is actually pretty good, and he gives this movie a very unique sort of flavor, a unique sort of feel, especially with the boxing scenes. You won't really see boxing scenes like this in any of the other movies in the franchise. He really does direct the hell out of this movie. But the problem I have with this movie is the story itself. I find the sort of the conflict between Adonis and Dame, it's just not very interesting to me, if I'm being totally honest. And I found the actual character of Dame, he's meant to be the main villain in the movie, but I just didn't really feel like he was as big a threat as he could have been. But I think Jonathan Majors certainly does look the part, and he looked like he could have been a really threatening villain in this movie, but I just don't think it's really pulled off all that well. It's still a very entertaining movie, and I do find it a bit more memorable than Creed 2. But yeah, as I said, it's just some issues with the story that I have. but it's a very fun movie nonetheless. But yeah, that is Creed 3 in 8th place. Right, so into 7th place now, and I'm going to go with Rocky 5. So yeah, with Rocky 5, we find Rocky returning home after beating Ivan Drago, but he finds out that he's suffered some pretty horrific head injuries that have become permanent, and he finds that if he continues with boxing, it may prove catastrophic for him, so he reluctantly decides to hang up his gloves and retire. And then at the same time, he finds that he loses all of his money and he loses his wealth, essentially. He and his family then have to return to the modest life that they had in the first Rocky movie. He is advised by financial advisors that he could easily make the money back if he was to, take part in a few more boxing matches. But because of his injury, he doesn't want to risk his life. We then get introduced to the character of Tommy Gunn, and Rocky kind of sees something in him and he wants to make him into the next sort of underdog. He feels like he could be the next Rocky, but things take a very sharp turn when we find out the kind of character that Tommy Gunn is. Now, I know this movie is probably considered the worst amongst Rocky fans, but there's one thing going for this movie that I think elevates it just a little bit more than those two movies I've already mentioned, and that is Sylvester Stallone himself. You can just tell he loves playing Rocky. He's just in love with the character, and I just think he's fantastic in this movie. Yes, it is a very misguided attempt to take the franchise kind of back to its roots. It doesn't quite work. I think the story doesn't quite work. I think the way this movie ends kind of goes against what we've become used to in, the Rocky movies as a whole. So I can understand that there are some serious issues with the story, but I do just find this movie a little bit more memorable. I actually quite enjoy the street fight at the end between Rocky and Tommy. I know a lot of people complain that there's no traditional boxing match in this movie, but I kind of feel after 5 movies, it's kind of nice to see something a little bit different and the formula changed up a little bit. But I know that is, a strong contentious point with a lot of people. I still understand its flaws and, it still only falls into 7th place. But I do have a good time with it nonetheless. But yeah, that is Rocky 5 in 7th place. Right into 6th place now, and this is probably going to be quite a hot take for some. I know if Scott over at Scott the Movie Critic is watching, he may be a bit shocked to see this one ranked so low. But I'm going to go with Rocky 3 in 6th place. So with Rocky 3, Rocky has beaten Apollo Creed in their rematch and he becomes world champion, and he finds that his life has completely changed for the better. He's now world champion. He's got lots of money. He's a worldwide superstar. But not long after all of this happens, he then gets challenged by this new up-and-coming ferocious fighter played by Mr. T. And that is, of course, the character of Clubber Lang. Now, I know this movie is very entertaining, and I do have a blast with it. It's got a great soundtrack. It's a lot of fun. But the reason why this movie ranks a bit lower for me is because the story itself just feels a lot more basic in comparison to the first 2 Rocky movies. I mean, with this movie, it's basically just Rocky becomes world champion. He takes part in a fight with Clubber Lang. He gets beaten. He goes away. He trains. He has a rematch with him and he beats him. That's basically the movie. There's not really much more substance to it. And maybe we don't necessarily need that. But for me, I just feel like it's missing something. It's missing that sort of that edge with the story. But it's still a lot of fun nonetheless. Clubber Lang is one of the most memorable villains in the franchise, of course. Mr. T is just completely chewing the scenery as the character. And it is a lot of fun. And it's nice to see Carl Weathers returning as Apollo Creed and, playing more of a good guy role in this movie. That is great to see. But yeah, it's just the sort of the basicness of the story, which why it falls a bit lower for me, but it's still a very fun movie nonetheless. But yeah, that is Rocky 3 in 6th place. Right, so into 5th place now, and I'm going to go with Rocky 2. So with Rocky 2, it takes place straight away after the ending of the first one. Apollo Creed has beaten Rocky and retained his world championship. But whilst he did win the match, a lot of people feel as though Rocky won the fight, and they feel like Apollo didn't really deserve the win. And that really bothers him, and he basically wants a rematch with Rocky. But Rocky kind of feels like he's done what he set out to do. He took part in the boxing fight, and now he wants to just go away and kind of make a life for his new family. He gets married, he has a child, and he basically just wants to move away from all that. But he finds that he just can't get away from the boxing world, and before we know it, he does get back into it, and he takes part in a rematch against Apollo Creed. Now, I really like this movie. I think it's a really solid sequel to the first movie. The only issue I have with it is that it's basically just the same movie again as the first Rocky, but just not as interesting. I find this movie a bit slower paced and not as interesting with some of the things Rocky does in the movie. But I will say that this movie does have one of the best and most underrated boxing matches in the entire franchise. I just think that rematch with Rocky and Apollo is just awesome and really tense in places and just a lot more memorable than their fight in the first movie. But it's just some aspects of the story I just find a bit slow, and it doesn't really do much different in comparison to the first movie, but it's still a really solid entry in the franchise nonetheless. But yeah, that is Rocky 2 in 5th place. Right, so into 4th place now, and I'm going to go with Creed, the first movie in the Creed franchise. This franchise is, of course, about the character of Adonis Creed, played by Michael B. Jordan. Adonis is the illegitimate son of Apollo Creed from the Rocky movies, and Adonis finds that he wants to basically follow in his father's footsteps, and he enlists the help of Rocky, who was, of course, played by Sylvester Stallone, to help him make this dream become a reality. Now, I really like this movie. I think it was a really good movie, to be fair. I remember when it was first announced, I was very skeptical about the idea of doing essentially a spin-off of the Rocky franchise. I just didn't think it was a good idea. But I have to admit, I think this movie really works and it really pulled it off. It's very, very similar in terms of story in comparison to the first Rocky movie, but it just changes a few little things, makes the character just that little bit different from Rocky. And it also puts it in a modern time, of course. But I think this movie really works. I think the story's great. I think all of the characters are great in it. Michael B. Jordan's really good as Adonis. Sylvester Stallone is great as Rocky. It's probably his best performance as Rocky in the entire franchise. And I think he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars for his role. And yeah, it's no surprise, really, because he really is very good in this movie. So on the whole, I think it's a fantastic movie and definitely one of the best in the franchise. But yeah, that is Creed in 4th place. Right, so into 3rd place now, and I'm going to go with Rocky Balboa. So with Rocky Balboa, it takes place quite a few years after Rocky 5. We find Rocky is living a very modest, very quiet life back on the streets of Philadelphia. He's no longer a huge superstar anymore, but he is kind of considered a bit of a local legend. But he just kind of spends his days kind of, running this restaurant and, just living a very quiet, peaceful life. But at some point in the movie, he is challenged to an exhibition fight with this new young boxer by the name of Mason Dixon, and he decides to take part in it despite the obvious physical and age differences between the two fighters. But it's kind of a chance for him to just have one more shot in the boxing world. Now, when this movie came out, I remember I absolutely loved it, and to this day I still love it. And I remember at the time, everyone else I spoke to about it had the same opinion, that they loved this movie. But I feel like this movie has kind of fallen down the rankings for a lot of people, and that people don't really like it as much as they used to. And I don't really get that, to be honest. I think this movie is a great return to form after Rocky 5. I think it's a very uplifting movie. I love the boxing fight at the end. It feels like some of the most realistic boxing fights we've ever seen in the franchise. And I just think the overall message in this movie is very inspirational. And yeah, I just absolutely love it. I just think it's a great sort of final fight for Rocky and a great movie to kind of return to the franchise and kind of atone for what they got wrong with Rocky 5. And yeah, I can't really say much more than that. I think it's a fantastic movie and one of my absolute favorites in the franchise. And yeah, that is Rocky Balboa in third place. Right, so into second place now, and I'm going to go with Rocky 4. So with Rocky 4, it takes place not too long after the end of the third movie. Rocky has beaten Clubber Lang. He has again become world champion. But not long after the movie begins, we get introduced to the character of Ivan Drago, played by Dolph Lundgren, and he challenges Rocky to a fight, and it's kind of seen as this classic East versus West kind of battle because his character comes from Russia. But before that fight happens, the character of Apollo Creed decides he wants to fight him first. But when that fight happens, tragedy unfortunately ensues, and the character of Apollo dies. And then Rocky decides he wants to fight Drago next, and it becomes a very sort of personal fight for Rocky. Now, I know this movie may not be considered the greatest in the franchise in terms of story and characters, and I might seem like a bit of a hypocrite for ranking Rocky 3 so low because of its simplicity, because this movie is just as basic and as simple as Rocky 3, but when I was a kid and I watched the Rocky movies, this was always the one I returned to the most. I just find this movie so entertaining from start to finish. It just gets straight into the action and it doesn't let up until the end. It's just so fun, and it has such an amazing soundtrack that I just love listening to. I can just listen to this soundtrack on its own without the movie. And yeah, this movie's just so fun. It's so 80s, it's so crazy. And we also have a great villain with Ivan Drago. He just feels like one of the most threatening villains in the entire franchise. You do wonder if Rocky's even going to have a chance against this guy. And yeah, I just think it's a really fun movie from start to finish. I know it's not one of the greatest in terms of story, and it is very simple and very basic, like I said, but I just have so much nostalgia for it, and I think nostalgia can be very strong when you're voicing your opinions about movies, and when you have nostalgia for something, whether it's a good or bad movie, the nostalgia you have for it is always going to win in comparison to anything else. So yeah, for those reasons, I've got to put Rocky 4 into second place. Right, so into first place now, and it is of course the original Rocky from 1976. Just that classic underdog story of the character of Rocky Balboa, who is this nobody character who comes from the streets of Philadelphia. He's kind of a petty criminal, but he does a little bit of boxing on the side. But he gets given the chance to take part in this match against Apollo Creed, who is the world champion boxer, and Rocky decides he wants to take a shot at it. But as well as that, it's just a really heartfelt drama about the character of Rocky, the struggles he faces, the romance he has with the character of Adrian. And it's just a fantastic drama, really uplifting movie. And I just can't really say anything negative about it. It's just the perfect story with great performances from the entire cast. And yeah, like I said, just a really inspirational story, and very uplifting, especially for younger people who may be looking to get into sports, whether it be boxing or something else. It's just a classic movie. I can't give it any bad marks, to be honest. It is a masterpiece for me. And yeah, that is Rocky in first place. So there you go, guys. That is my ranking for the Rocky and Creed franchise. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments below if you've seen the Rocky and Creed movies. What do you think of them? What would be your ranking of the franchise? Do you agree with my ranking? Do you disagree? It would be great to hear your thoughts. But until then, I will leave the video there. So thanks for watching and take care.